I'm going to read all the questions first, and then we can divide into different groups. Do scientific theories such as quantum theory, multiverse, and Darwinian evolution challenge the notion of God?
These arguments, from my perspective, are not really truly valid because they're not complete. When you think about, does science prove God or disprove God, you have to approach it from the validness of the argument. You got to look at its premises. And I think this argument is incomplete. If someone was to say it's impossible to prove or disprove the existence of God, that would be more valid. And then we will have to look at the specifics of it. What it's really referring to when it says science, And I think if we are referring to proving God through experimentation, then the argument is valid. You cannot prove God through experimentation because you cannot test the supernatural. It is not possible. Sciences can only study what exists within the space-time continuum. We cannot study anything beyond that. And even with that, as you mentioned, quantum mechanics, today, the more we learn about quantum mechanics, the more we realize that we do not know much. Things like quantum entanglement, it is really mystifying, measurements. When we did the measurements, we see that for example, electrons, when they get entangled, even if we separate them to distances, we can say cosmic distances, such as 10 billion light years apart, we realize that, they are behaving exactly the same as soon as we measure one of them. And electrons have upspin and a downspin. As soon as you measure one of them, if it has an upspin, then the other one is having a downspin. Even if there's vast distances, which really collapses the famous special relativity principle of Einstein, who said, nothing travels faster than light. And there's no way there can be an information flow between the two particles. But this is the reality. This has been proven, and 3 physicists have received a Nobel Prize for it. So when we say, can we prove God or disprove God through scientific methodologies, I can say you can do neither both, because you cannot test God. But the impossibility of disproving God is a more valid argument, because it's impossible for us to disprove God. However, we can provide logical explanations. We can say philosophical explanations with valid premises, or theology, or even theoretical science to prove God.
Okay, so when I saw these questions, especially the quantum mechanics one, I told myself, so why do people think that it's controversial? It could be controversial to God, like existence of God. So do you know what's the motivation behind it? Do you know why do people think these sort of scientific finds could disprove God?
Scientific studies cannot disprove God. There is no such a thing. The reason people derive this sort of conclusions, they're not really scientists, to be honest. That's why they come to these types of conclusions. Because quantum physics, when we look at quantum mechanics, the only thing that is discovered there is that it seems to be behaving randomly. It seems to be. I'm saying it seems to be because in reality, I don't believe in absolute randomness, because there is an underlying laws there which still indicates to determinism. Because if you can measure something, which means it's determined, it's measurable. But arguments like, for example, the superposition of an electron, a particle, it could be in 2 different places at the time, for example, or particles behaving like matter and wave at the same time, sort of gives us the idea that there is some form of randomness there. But behind every randomness, there's definitely determinism. The reason they argue, this may argue against the God argument, because you might remember Einstein famously said God doesn't play dice. However, most people do not mention that in 1920, Einstein sort of modified that statement, and he said, God does play dice with the laws he has established. So at the end of the day, even if there is some form of probability there, it is still based on determinism because the laws has been established by God. So I think that's where the confusion comes from. You know, when they say there is indeterminism, that means that no one is controlling it. I think that's a wrong claim.
You're saying you're kind of in between Einstein and Heisenberg, because one of them says, actually what we knew about Einstein, he says like God doesn't bias, and Heisenberg said no, there's randomness, so even if you don't like it, there's randomness in the universe. But you kind of say, as a believing person perspective, well, according to scientific argument, it could look like random, but there's another rule behind it, and we need to discover those rules for the science.
Yes, what I believe is, you know, quantum physics have not even reached its peak. It's far from what we can learn in there. That is why these sort of findings may seem random to us. Or Heisenberg's theory is that indeterminism, as you know. But these things, just because we can't measure a particle at a particular time, that doesn't mean that particle is at a specific place, at location, at a specific time. Maybe there is a problem with our measurements. We haven't discovered certain things yet. But my general notion in this is this. We know that the universe is a deterministic place, the macrocosm. We know everything works with certain plan. There's no doubt about that. Like, for example, we know exactly the location that Jupiter, for example, will be in 6 months' time. We can calculate this. If you're calculating something, and if you know that there are established laws there, then there is perfect determinism there in the macrocosm. The argument is quantum mechanics doesn't behave as what we understand in the general standard model of physics. Perhaps we're not really understanding it well. Because my idea is this, if you say there is indeterminism or there's complete randomness or just probabilities within the quantum world, in that miniature world, it would not really logically make sense, because little particles behaving randomly cannot come together to form perfect, determinism. It doesn't make sense. It will be like, for example, a watch that you have on your arm. It's a perfectly working mechanism. And then you are investigating all the tiny pieces, components of the watch, and you seem to think that there is, indeterminism there. There's randomness there. But random particles cannot, join in harmony to build a universal determinism. And that doesn't sound right to me. I think we have a lot to learn about quantum mechanics.
There's determinism in the macro level, but when you have a look at the little particles at the quantum level, almost all of them, they have free wills. Like, particles consist of free wills. They make a universe, and then that universe behaves like deterministic way. That's a really interesting way to see. Like Bediüzzaman Said Nursi also says that if you don't give this to God, only and one God, so you have to give everything to these particles. They have to have some sort of perfect network among them so that they can know what to do. That's a good way as a believing perspective. Thank you very much, Abir. What about the multiverse? What is multiverse?
The multiverse theory really originates from the idea that the universe that we live in is too perfect. In fact, physicists call our universe improbable. It's not probable universe because it works with, perfect, precision and certain laws. And something that began as a chaotic expansion, inflation with the Big Bang, how could it, turn into this perfectly working, harmonious place, orderous place that produced life? As if all the way through since 13.8 billion years ago, since the Big Bang, it seems that the universe had a direction to produce life. That's the way it looks. And they are saying that this is improbable. So this is not possible. So when we say it must have been done or created by an intelligent being, a supernatural being, they try to find an alternative argument by coming up with theories like the multiverse. And they're saying, well, if there is a larger system, which is consisting of billions of universes. And most of them are always failing, but one of them by chance turned out to be like this, perfect. This is where the idea comes from, but it doesn't really disprove the argument of God, because even people who put forward these arguments, and support them, such as, the Japanese or American scientists, we should say, Michio Kaku, he says he even believes some sort of a power, a God. So he's one of the biggest champions of the multiverse theory. Technically, what I would say to this is everything that exists needs an explanation of its existence. And this explanation needs to be plausible, acceptable explanation. And we know that one of the most fundamental principles of physics is causality. We know that there is before every effect, that there is a preceding cause. And when we apply this model to the universe, we come to a point in the Big Bang, we call it the Planck barrier, where all causes cease to exist. And Big Bang itself is an effect, but we need a cause for it. So we are either going to say a supernatural, powerful being, designed this, caused all of this, or we are going to try to find alternative arguments to God, such as multiverse. But that doesn't change the argument, as I said, because multiverse would be just a bigger system, and it would require causality too, because we know that space-time cannot be infinite. It cannot be beginningless. Because if we say space-time is beginningless, like the multiverse, then logically, or we can say philosophically, we should have never arrived at the present. Since we can never go to the beginning, if it's beginningless, go back, then we shouldn't have arrived at the present either. This is a philosophical argument, which means that everything that is temporal, everything that is contingent, everything that is dependable on external things cannot be infinite and eternal. And we know matter is not infinite. We know energy is not infinite. So they all had a beginning, which means that at the very beginning, we have to establish a cause that doesn't need a cause. A cause that doesn't need a cause. Well, in Islamic, theology, we call this musabbibul asbab. Causes everything, but does not need to be caused itself, because it's not bound by space-time. It is not a matter. This power is not a matter, which we name God. So I think this is the idea of God, really. And from a scientific perspective, whether it's quantum mechanics or classical physics, you can never disprove the existence of God. And furthermore, maybe as a last thing, I should say this too. People who actually tries to disprove God, we have to say that philosophically, the burden of proof is upon them. So if you're denying something, you need to prove your argument. And as I said, scientifically, this is not possible. It's impossible to disprove God. But as I said, philosophically and scientifically, you can put forward many arguments to prove God. There are arguments like the teleological argument, the design argument. We see this perfect measurement in everything we study in nature. There are, temporal regress argument. As I said, you can never follow causality all the way to infinity. For example, there are arguments like, possibility argument, because everything we study in the universe are just possibilities. They are not dependent on their own existence. They are dependent on external things, objects. So if the entire universe is like that, it's only a possibility, then there must be a being whose existence is not a possibility but a necessity. Namely, this is God.
One of the arguments of people who are trying to disprove God, they say science and religion, they are rivals. One of them should be the winner. If one of them is the winner, then the other is the loser. What do you say about these rivalry? So do you distinguish two? Because if there's a beginning of the existence, science has to stop there and shouldn't bring any other argument. They just need to say, well, there's a beginning and we don't know what's what's behind it. To me, that's the limit of science. Beyond that, I can believe Allah. Someone else could believe some other things. But of course, we can argue that so believing Allah is the easiest way there. Do you distinguish both two or kind of merge and try to prove Allah through science?
Look, I think we need to merge science with belief, but in a theological sense, not in a like religious scripture sense, but more in a theological and philosophical sense. And I don't believe science and religion contradicts. You may find some misinterpretations, such as in the Bible. That's why science sort of became a rival of the religion, especially in the West, because there were some contradicting textual things in the Bible. But that's not a proof that science shouldn't be hand in hand with religion. I think they can be reconciled. They can coexist. There is no doubt about that, because we know that the universe is just not about physical things. It's not just about quantum mechanics and standard physics. There is something beyond that. We know that with even human beings, that there's something beyond to us. We're not just heap of molecules, proteins, amino acids. There's something beyond that with us. We have these emotions, we have these feelings, we have a soul, which cannot be described through scientific means. So we need to explore into metaphysics as well. And I think science is also dependent on metaphysics as well. And like you said, there are people who say that we don't need to go beyond a point where the universe started. I think that's not a valid thing. That's not a valid argument. Why? Why shouldn't we go beyond? Because philosophically, there should be a beginning, then something had to cause it. So we need to know what caused it. We don't necessarily, people who are objective on this issue, they don't necessarily need to say that it is God, but something caused it. I believe it was God, but it's a different thing. So when we say arguments for God, there could be scientific arguments for God too, but there is a difference between proof and evidence. People confuse that. So we can provide many evidences for the existence of God, but to prove scientifically, you would have to actually test God, which is not possible, because you cannot test a supreme being who created everything, including science, with the tools that he has created. That's not possible. So when we talk about science, we shouldn't be talking about science as if it was a religion. There is a big issue too these days, because science is changeable too. What scientists used to think 100 years ago is changed today. Maybe what we think is a certainty today will change in 100 years' time. But the concept of God never changes. So science changes as well. Science is not a religion. People should not approach it that way. And science was there long before human beings appeared. The rules, the laws, all of them, they were already in effect in the universe. We are just discovering them. We're not inventing them. So we have to understand this as well. We are just studying the design that was already created. So in fact, when we study this beautiful design, magnificent, calculations, precision, fine-tuning in the universe, we should, necessarily should say, there must be a designer behind this. There must be a perfect, powerful being behind this. I think science should lead people to God, in reality, not distant themselves from God. Yeah.
The third part of the question, the evolution theory. Like to me, as I said, my position is to leave science to scientific people, science people. If you go to a doctor and if you have a sickness, you should expect from the doctor to tell you what's happening in your body. You don't expect from a doctor to tell you, okay, you need to pray God, Allah causes this. So you need to expect some scientific explanation. So when we go to the origin of species, scientific people, of course, they won't look at the scriptures. They will try to find out what's behind it, where did we come from. So that's why I see 100% normal to try to find out the origin of the species from the scientific perspective. Of course, you said something in the beginning of this discussion. You said they are not scientists, the ones who say, so these sort of things disprove God. Yeah. They're not scientists.
They're not objective.
Yeah, they're not objective. That's why I'm on the same side with you on that perspective. But what do you think about evolution and our scripture?
Well, look, if we look at the theory of evolution, in the sense that we have this concept in Islam which we call tekamül, it's progression. Like, for example, if we just evaluate the term evolution itself, it means progression. So we see this happening, throughout nature anyway. Like a baby forming in the mother's womb, you can say it's evolving. So it's a progression. And no one can argue against that when you think about it. There is it goes through stages to stages, embryo, you have the fetus. So there's a development and progression there. In nature, there's progression too. There's no doubt about that. We accept that. But in regards to evolution and religion, let me make this statement first. I think this is very important. I always say this. Evolution should not be rejected or accepted based on religious understanding. That's what I think. I think religious theological understanding should not mix within scientific methodologies. So if we want to disprove or prove evolution, we need to use scientific methodologies. I think this is very important first. Now, in regards to evolution itself, when I look at nature, the way things, progress, the way things develop, I can see that some of the most fundamental arguments of evolution is true. Things like mutations, things like natural selections, things like adaptations. These are all reality. They're facts. They're scientific facts. No one can argue against this. You cannot use religious arguments to fight against this. However, when we go into nitty-gritties, smaller pieces, we see that there are very big assumptions in there as well, such as interspecies evolution. Does one species evolve into completely another species? There is no proofs for this. The only evidence they have is fossil records. That's all. You can, dig up some fossils, and based on their resemblance, you can say this must have come from this. That is not valid either. That's not very scientific proof. Anyone can make that assumption. In reality, all living creatures, in regards to DNA, they're all similar. Our genetic structure is similar. So based on the similarities, you cannot say this must have come from this must have come from this. So I don't believe there is like lab evidence. Not just I don't believe, it's a fact. There is no lab evidence to interspecies evolution. That's very questionable. My personal view is every species had an Adam. That's my personal view. There are scientists in the world today who completely argue against gradual evolution. Like there is a group called Intelligent Design Scientists. They actually provide evidence that it could not have happened. And I'm talking about interspecies evolution. But if you're talking about, mutations, we observe these things, at microbiological levels. We know that viruses, bacteria can mutate, but they never become, completely another species. They mutate within themselves, within their own, mechanism, so they can protect themselves from various things. We know that. For example, bacteria mutate so it can protect itself from, the antibiotics that we constantly try to kill it with. So this is a given thing. This is part of the mechanism. This is part of genetics. However, we cannot provide any evidence, a solid proof to show that one species actually, evolved into completely different species. In fact, when we look at the fossil evidence, there are a lot of problematic things in there. I can give you one example. Like I had a look at the evolution of whales. Whales are the biggest animals that the earth has ever seen. They are bigger than dinosaurs. Like blue whale can grow up to 180 tons. It's a huge animal. If you look at the evolutionary history of whales, they've been around in the oceans for 30 million years. But when you go back, they come from this species, according to evolutionists. It's a dog-like species, only about 45 kilos, as I remember, Pachytechus, and it lived around in the mountains of Pakistan. That's where the name comes from. This 45 kilo dog, they're saying within 20 million years, evolved into a aquatic animal, a mammal that lives in the sea. And for 30 million years, whales have been around. You cannot make this connection by just looking at some fossils and saying this comes from that. It doesn't make sense to me. Or like, for example, with the human evolution, they say, the first time that, ape-like creatures stood up, it's called the Homo erectus. They have the fossil of it too. And they say the reason this is an ancestor of a human being, because when we analyze the skull, it's about, the size of its skull is about 450 cubic centimeters. And they say human brain is 1,400 cubic centimeters. So it's evolving, and it stood up for the first time. But I'll tell you something very interesting. There are human beings, absolute full human beings today in the world. Their brain capacity is exactly like the Homo erectus. That's what I mean by, just resemblance. You cannot establish a connection just based on resemblance, skeletal resemblance. I think there is more evidence needed if they want to, prove that interspecies evolution had really happened. But as I said, I don't think religion should be involved in this, because with us, I have no problem with some of the arguments of evolution. The biggest problem that would arise is with Adem alayhi salam, because yes, there are verses in the Quran which evolutionists use, like you say, you were in a different, more lower base of, state in the past before you became this. But there is also very clear verses in the Quran that Adem alayhi salam was created in paradise. That would be a big issue, from a religious perspective, that, human beings began as a human being. That's what I believe. That's my personal belief. I do not think we evolved from some other species.
I don't think I'm going to have any problems with all the species are evolved from a single bacteria. But when it comes to Adam alayhi salam, as you said, there are clear verses, and that's the hardest part of this evolutionary theory, because there are verses about it. Would someone be disbeliever if he or she believes that, they were Homo erectus, Allah chose us, one of them, namely Adam alayhi salam, and took him to paradise because Allah is the most powerful, he can do whatever he wants. And you can take the verses metaphoric sense, and then he was given cognitive skills and sent down to earth. Would people become disbeliever if they believe this?
Look, maybe I should say this, whether interspecies evolution have occurred, whether we come from a common ancestor or not, I can say with certainty that this hasn't been scientifically established yet. They are still assumptions. They are assumptions based on observations of fossils and genetic resemblance. So it is not a really established thing. That's why we should not jump the gun and say, look, let's accept this totally as a package, and let us try to sort of alter or modify revelation to match this. That is not a very good thing to do. That's not a very smart thing to do, because if 50 years later, if science discovers that evolution never took place, then what sort of a position would you be in? So if there are people today who are saying, look, evolution might have happened, interspecies evolution coming from one common ancestor, but it was guided by God, they don't become disbelievers. The main thing is to believe in God there, as long as you know that, God governs everything in the universe, every little tiny thing, from, electrons spinning around the nucleus of the atom, all the way to giant galaxies, orbiting around itself or spinning around its center. everything is governed by God according to Islamic theology. So we cannot say God did not intervene in such and such incident. You know, he created a bacteria and he let it go to see what would happen randomly. That is absurd in Islamic theology. But if someone says, okay, it might have happened, but it's God who willed the process, then you're not truly accepting evolution anyway, because evolution says it's random. But you're not saying it's not random. You're saying it's not random. It is controlled. It has a direction. Like, for example, natural selection has a direction. For example, one being is slowly developing an eye, and it takes millions of years. There is a direction there. It is slowly heading towards the final target to develop a perfect eye. So if there is direction, that cannot be random. There is a problematic to think that it's random. So it is how we describe and define evolution too. Maybe that's one of the problems as well. And I say to people, okay, if you want to accept it, you know, and say it is theistic evolution, there's people like who believe that as well, theistic evolution, God-governed evolution, then why would you use the term evolution? Come up with a different terminology then, you know. Theistic progression, you know, natural progression through theistic guidance, for example, or divine guidance. So you can come up with a different argument to challenge that. But as I said, I don't think we should be doing these things based on religion. We shouldn't be saying, oh, I did not come from monkeys and just, you know, on religious. But I think it should be done through scientific means. I think, you know, if we want to reject it, then we should provide evidence to reject it, scientific evidence. That would be the right methodology. Yeah.
Can we say, like, a scientist with conscience could say, okay, I just explained the process. Through this process, you can believe that it's governed by God, and science doesn't touch that, respects that, but I only try to explain the process. Yeah, that's the scientific way of looking at things, right?
Yes.
And for a religious person perspective, he also needs to think that, all right, they are the scientists, they are trying to find out what happened, they're trying to find the origin of the species. I respect them. I always should know that. So in the past as well, in the science, there are a lot of things they had to change, like the reality of light, for example. Is it a wave or is it a particle? So they believed it as a wave for about 100 years, and then someone came that it has a particle like properties as well. They laughed at them. But it changed. Like, science doesn't mean that it's 100% correct. There are a lot of things in the science that they cannot explain, like, as you said, superposition principle, or if they're observed or not observed, they behave differently, sort of things. They still cannot explain, and they don't say, oh, we don't believe science because it doesn't make sense. They say, we will definitely find out what's going to happen. Yeah. So, as a religious people, we also need to say that we don't have to know all the answers now.
Yes. Yeah.
If we don't have any answers to some certain things, we don't have to reject religion. We just need to say, oh, it's not time. We need to take time. We need to discuss. We need to, like, try to help each other to find out the truth.
Yeah. You made a very good point there, and I'll tell you why you made a very good point there. You see, with evolution, in particular with evolution, if you remove the God factor, you know, a creator factor, I can tell you that scientifically it is the best explanation that you can provide for origin of species. There is no better explanation. It is a beautiful theory. That's what scientists would say, without the God factor. But the thing is, the only problem with the evolution theories, and maybe one of the biggest misunderstood concepts of evolution, is evolution does not explain how life originated. People think that evolution explains how life originated. There is no such a thing in evolution. Darwinian evolution is based on origin of species by means of natural selection and adaptation and mutations, for example. Origin of life is not explained by evolution. There was a theory called spontaneous generation. which was brushed aside. There is no evidence to it. They couldn't prove it, and they brushed it aside. See, abiogenesis, they also called it. The living beings just arise from chemical reactions, the first living being, like single-cell bacteria, and later on to survive, because they need to consume something. All living beings need to eat. They ate each other, they say. This was the view, abiogenesis view. But later on, that was completely dismissed. Scientifically, it was dismissed. And scientists accepted the biogenesis theory. Life can only come from life. This is the principle. And the first person to prove this was Louis Pasteur. He actually did that, experimentation on this, and his tubes are still displayed in the museum today. So there's no life emerging in there. So biogenesis is the theory that we accept. So there had to be a creation in the beginning, because it's impossible to explain how lifeless matter, inanimate matter, becomes living being. It's impossible. So that is why they say life comes from life. But Darwinian evolution suggests that what it explains is the first being produced all the different species later on. Now, as I said at the beginning, I believe in adaptation. I believe we were created, designed, our genes were designed to adapt to the conditions in the environment. And we have many proofs of this, like if you climb high mountains and stay there for a long time, you start, adaptation occurs in your system, biological system. Your body begins to produce more red blood cells, so there can be enough oxygen carried to your brain. Adaptation occurs. However, what they don't understand is there is a limit to that as well. It is limited by your genetic structure, genetic coding, which means that if you go higher than what we call the death zone, I think it's about 8,000 meters, you do not adapt anymore. The system will not adapt anymore. It will die. There will be fatality. But evolution pushes this, out of its limits. Like fish coming out of the water, all the seas are drying up, and then most of them die, but some of them survives. I don't accept that. You can get all the fish out of the oceans today. You can test that they will all die. They will not adapt because they cannot breathe oxygen like us because they breathe through their gills. It won't happen. This is what the evolution wants us to accept. So they have to provide solid evidence to this. That is where the problem is. Otherwise, in general, as I said, the theory of evolution, such as natural selection, adaptations, mutations, gene variations in the gene pool, these are all scientific, facts, I should say. Nobody denies them. If science has proven something, we don't deny it. If it hasn't proven something yet, if it's only at a theoretical stage, we can be skeptical. We are allowed to question it.
That's the science.
That is the problem here. We are allowed to question it. If you don't question it, then there is a problem with you. Then you're not being an objective scientist. So I don't know why people get very upset when somebody questions some of the components of the evolution theory. They brand them straight away as, backward or creationist and things like that. Why? People are questioning the Big Bang theory. People are questioning the multiverse theory. Nobody's, accusing them of being unscientific because this is science. You're allowed to question if it's not been established as an, acceptable theory by everyone. You can question it. There's no problem with it. So I can question evolution theory too, or some components of it, some parts of it, based on scientific evidence. I can question it. What the evolutionary scientists do not like is, they're not fond of, is when people question it on religious basis. Like you said, they're two different things. So my advice is to question it from a biological perspective, from a paleontological perspective. There is nothing wrong with that. If you have the evidence, question it. If there are things that has been proven, then accept it. You shouldn't reject that too. You should accept it as well.